Cool winds swept through the narrow brick alley, and Kai's boots softly scuffed the cobblestones. A skim of mildew coated the crumbling bricks, a result of the encroaching moisture seeping into the desolate remains of the once grand island city. Kai only knew the ruins, never having seen Osasenza in all its former glory. Her and the other inhabitants of the city now drifted like ghosts in the remnants of the stone citadels. Kai walked through the familiar alleys and streets of the city, the view of the ominous ocean increasingly visible between the towers. She approached the outskirts, where the sea abruptly met the buildings, although the streets and structures continued beneath the waves. Beneath the deceptively mirrored surface of the rusty water, a whole city lurked, crumbling in the corrosive water. The inquisitiveness which Kai had thought she'd lulled to sleep furiously awakened with an impatient roar. Why was the ocean so hazardous to almost everyone but her? Why were the stones that held up the city, that held up her life, crumbling away before their eyes? Every year the water lapped closer to the Osasenza's center, and the few inhabitants were pushed back further into the city's inner districts. Kai sighed and trudged onwards toward the drop-off point into the water. Maybe if she walked slowly enough, the ocean would come to her. At the water's edge, Kai prepared to dive. She shed her baggy canvas land pants, leaving her waterproof leggings. They had been traded to her a few weeks ago by the clothing stall at the weekly market, in exchange for fish bones for needles and a sheet of pliable seaweed Kai had scavenged from the submerged wreckage. Despite their productive trade relationship, Kai wasn't particularly close with the twins that ran the stall, or anyone at the market, really. Among the few that regularly acknowledged her at the market, there were several that actively distrusted her, probably because of her regular interactions with the ocean, which they all feared due to the havoc it could wreak on all of their lives. If she thought about it more, she wasn't in the habit of being friendly with them either. Kai found starting conversations difficult and was solitary and contentious by nature, or perhaps by habit. The others of the city didn't socialize much either, generally focusing on scraping by, and even in their degeneration, divided themselves into groupings of supernatural ability. Nature witches stuck together in the ancient overgrown park, and the few shapeshifters lived on the eastern Main Street. Kai was occasionally invited to what few communal events they had, but after ending up in several shouting matches with the patronizing pots and pan sellers, she generally stayed home. Patting her empty storage bags for luck, she dove into the murky ocean in search of anything usable in the flooded remnants of the past, to be traded at the market the next day. The underwater ruins were familiar. Kai had combed this area before, and having salvaged anything useful, found it necessary to search further into the ruins. Depth didn't bother her because of her increased lung capacity, but the darkness and shadows of the crumbling buildings were disconcerting and difficult to navigate. A glint of something metallic caught her eye. Inside a cathedral so huge the tip of its spire protruded from the water's surface. She quelled her original surge of excitement, wary of the squalls of silvery fish which she often mistook for metal. However, this glint seemed genuine. She dove inside the cathedral, wincing as she cut her side slightly as she dove through the edifice's broken stained glass window. Inside the cathedral, rotting wood beams stretched across the ceiling, dust floating thickly in the water. The floor glittered occasionally with crushed glass, and shafts of navy blue tinted light shone through the windows, illuminating the interior. Kai skimmed the inside of the building, taking in the bare wooden pulpit and planks of decomposing benches. Some sort of ancient gathering hall from back when people really actually built things. Before the ocean started to encroach on the island's outskirts, before the earthquake that cleaved much of the upper-class district and the adjoining industrial sector of the city into the greedy sea, that was where Kai dove now, pillaging the remnants of the dead, along with animals and plant life growing on the ruins. For a few seconds she stood in silence, overwhelmed by bitter nostalgia for the era she'd never known. This soon progressed to that burning curiosity. Why did that era have to end? Kai renewed her search for refuse with vigor, scanning for potential merchandise and clues. She'd had suspicions as to the sinking nature of the city, or was it the rising nature of the sea? Nobody knew. But nothing conclusive had ever been found. None of the other city dwellers seemed to care, blissing out on mild consciousness-altering potions when they weren't altogether focused on survival. That brought it back to Edgar Vask, the Serene seller. Serene was an energy enhancer and a mainstay for almost everyone's lives, which Vask had a monopoly over. The only significant competition he'd ever had died under mysterious circumstances, and Kai regarded his success, in business and otherwise, as unnatural. She wasn't the only one with unusual powers. In fact, most had some mild supernatural abilities, which Serene enhanced, another factor making it so appealing. Vask's preternatural persuasiveness strengthened Kai's distress for the man, which she acknowledged made her dealings with him blunt and rude. Swimming close to the ground, her eyes caught on some debris, clearly not part of the original structure of the hall. A pile of old bottles, elongated necks like broken glass birds lying subject on the floor. Potion bottles were a rare find, and were highly valued by the few market stalls dealing in any liquid or potion trade. An even more engaging prospect was if they still contained liquid, as the few potions of long ago that Kai had found before were far more potent and smooth than the make-do ones that were brewed in the present. They'd fetched a real price at the market, and she began to gather up the warped glass into her fraying oilcloth sack. To Kai's slight chagrin, most of the bottles were empty, with the exception of a fully unbroken flask of cloudy dark liquid. She carefully packaged it in, making a note to herself to ask someone knowledgeable about it later. Then she saw something which gave her pause. The next bottle was mostly empty, save for a few centimeters of thick purple liquid. Although it was drying out and probably stale, it was unmistakably Serene. She automatically reached for it. Serene was used often by almost everyone in the city, and despite this bottle's age, its quality was almost certainly far higher than any Serene they'd ever had. She heard that the old recipe called for specific ingredients which were no longer available, including specific fruit. Most of the orchards had been uprooted by the long-ago earthquake, and those which were still above water were barren. Holding the bottle, Kai paused. Despite the rarity of the genuine potion, there were her own morals to consider. The sole Serene business in the city was run by Edgar Vask, who Kai personally found highly dubious, but nobody seemed to mind as long as they got their potions. If she wanted to sell this, it would be easier to do it through him, although she wasn't sure she wanted to sell it at all. She maintained a scornful air at those who depended on the potion for happiness and motivation. She tried it herself a few times, and although she felt dangerously compelled to pursue it further, she hadn't. But when presented with a bottle of preserved Serene of old Ossosenza, Kai felt the opportunity was too good to miss. As Kai mulled over the significance of her find, she gathered up the rest of the bottles. Picking up a fragile, slightly cracked bottle, she accidentally broke the eggshell glass, and the slightest stream of purple trickled out. More Serene? But this bottle was useless, cracked and containing scant amounts of potion. As Kai watched the purple Serene dissipate into the water, she noticed something strange. The violet liquid was slowly transitioning to maroon, then mahogany, then a familiar rust brown, blending in with the toxic clouds in the water. Kai gasped and sputtered, bubbles blowing from her nose in her shock. Was serene the cause of the rusty pestilence in the water? But people ingested serene every day and were fine, while contact with the rusty water produced illness and, in severe cases, death. Without thinking, she grabbed the almost full serene bottle and smashed it, letting the wine-colored liquid pour into the water. Again, after a few seconds, the purple changed to a rusty cloud. Kai knew that for any of the people in the city above, the brown tinge in the water spelled fear, even panic. Yet they'd depended on the potion all their lives. She floated, shocked and confused. The cloud of rusty hue around Kai slowly dispersed, diluting in the water, which now had the usual slightly oxidated tinge. At a loss for what to do, she absent-mindedly gathered bent carpentry nails and a tarnished silver ring from the ground, tossing them in her bag with the potion bottles. She thought anxiously about her discovery, her mind racing. What did this mean? Kai didn't know. The potion was somehow maybe polluting the ocean? Was it the same thing making the city sink? There was nothing connecting them, but her intuition raced ahead and insisted this was more information than she'd ever had. Her gaze drifted around the building, subliminally noting the beauty of the underwater hall. She noticed one last corked bottle of serene on the rotting wood underneath a pew, and gingerly gathered it into her bag. This find had none of the excitement of the first, with the newfound burdens of risk and mystery weighing down the bottle. Through one gaping window, she noticed a thicker cloud in the water, a saturated, rusty cloud, obscuring the surrounding ruins. Kai swam over, her bag trailing behind her. As Kai swam toward the serene cloud, her throat began to tickle, a clear sign her lung capacity was almost exhausted, and she'd have to come up for air soon. The air began to seem more concentrated with the muddy potion, and although she couldn't see as well, she could discern the shape of a stone tunnel, a passageway. Ignoring the pressure in her chest, Kai pressed on to examine the opening, which loomed through the witchy swirls of sediment. The tunnel was made of gray stone and brick, concurrent with the rest of the ruined city. Wondering what the tunnel could have been, she mentally examined the map of the old city she'd found, in what probably used to be a library. Although she'd long since committed the map to memory, she had difficulty placing this seemingly miscellaneous tunnel. Suddenly, she had a realization. The area she was currently swimming through was in an earthquake-induced crevice, revealing what lay underneath the old submerged city. She was looking at a sewer tunnel. That realization begged the question, why was so much of what was probably old Serene collecting around this sewer? Kai decided to examine the tunnel closer, grimacing as she swam through the oily sea. She was grateful she couldn't smell underwater. The sewer tunnel, which at first glanced had seemed solid, in fact was laced with cracks. As Kai watched, a small chunk of stone came dislodged, sending a plume of dust into the water. The stone surface of the tunnel was covered in a coagulated brickish dust, similar to the dry bottle of Serene she found earlier. Though Serene must have been flowing down the sewers from when people disposed of any potion they had left over, or even byproducts from its production. That explained why the water was so toxic. But why was the amount of it rising? The amount of cast-off Serene didn't seem proportionate to the drastic water rise. Kai felt lightheaded with the weight of her discovery. Or was it the weight of the water pressure on her lungs? She wasn't sure. Kai knew she should be worried, but this was so important that she'd been down longer in the past. Although admittedly that time she'd almost died and had to recuperate a week before diving again. She cast it out of her mind and swam on. Continuing to examine the tunnel, Kai noticed that it was far more degraded than the surrounding ruins and detritus. Theoretically, they were all built around the same time, out of the same materials, so why was the serene encrusted sewer tunnel dissolving into pebbles, while the other submerged ruins seemed relatively stoic, degrading slowly? The slick shape of an answer slowly bubbled to the surface of Kai's oxygen-deprived brain, but she was having a hard time getting a handle on it. Finally, the bubble popped, and she was left with a startling idea. Was the serene somehow dissolving the stone faster? Everyone Kai knew used the stuff regularly. How could they drink it without any inkling of the damage it could cause? She took the last bottle of found serene from her bag and prepared to pour it onto a rock. Kai felt a twinge of regret at pouring out the serene, a lingering pain at the money and approval she'd have received at the market for selling the rich old potion. She shook her head. She needed to know. The violet liquid gushed out of the lip of the bottle, then slowly into a trickle onto a porous piece of rock. She watched with bated breath, and speaking of breath, her lungs were getting really strained as the rock started to sizzle and crumble at the touch of the liquid serene. As the serene dried and oxidized in the water, the reaction on the rock slowed, yet continued the slow corrosion. This proves it. Serene was contaminating the ocean and also could degrade rock. Kai knew that this had deeper implications but couldn't seem to grasp them. Her vision was starting to get fuzzy and her limbs felt weak. All other swirling thoughts scattered in the wake of her overwhelming need to breathe. Kai kicked up from the ocean floor, her bag trailing beneath her as she strained upwards. The pressure bore down on her and her strokes weakened. She kicked upwards, legs flailing, but the surface didn't seem any closer. Darkness tinged on the edge of her vision, and her chest and lungs felt like they were about to pop. In the depths of Kai's murky consciousness, an impression of a thought rose, solidifying into an epiphany. She had just discovered the nature of what was sinking her city. She realized now that the sea was not rising. The city was collapsing. And she had to let people know. She had to do something. Even though the citizens of Asasenza were often insular and seemed to succumb to their decline without a fight, they continued to survive and thrive as a community, although that community was often uninclusive of the city's outcasts. This information changed everything, and the residents of the ruins deserved to know. For their sake as much as her own, Kai needed to survive and spread the word. With her last reserves of renewed vigor, Kai struggled outwards and upwards to the surface, her weakened limbs clicking into the familiar patterns. The ocean floor beneath her was clearly shallower, although her tortured upwards movement had rendered it further away. When she knew she couldn't take it any longer without a breath, her head broke the surface, and she gasped, guzzling great gulps of oxygen as her body slowly acclimated to its normal breathing pattern. A trickle of blood from her nose blended in with the rusty serene clouds in the water, and Kai floated, reveling in the ocean air. After floating and recuperating in the gentle waves for a while, Kai pulled herself to the shore. She pulled herself up onto the cracked cement diving point and stumbled, dripping and clattering, down the narrow, cobbled streets.